I guess they're setting up for a snowy scene.
Okay, copy that. Thank you.
And background and action. Hold on, reset, please. Reset, reset. Background, action.
So I'm sitting here watching this YouTube video and I wasn't recording it. I'm about halfway through the video and it's about death of the follower, quote unquote, and the future of creativity on the web by JackConteExtras, who I just realized is one of the creators, I suppose, of Patreon. And so I started recording here because I realized that there was some expression coming through that was inviting some form of capture. And I was like, you know what, okay, let me just put on the recorder. What I'm finding really interesting about this video is he's pointing toward how the following sort of developed within the culture of the internet. So the ways that a following has developed in internet connections and internet networking. And he's talking about this following sort of being the driving force behind the creator reaching people. He sort of divided into 3 tiers. The first tier, with the highest quantity of individuals, is reach. Then the second tier, with the lesser quantity of individuals, is following. And then this third tier, with the most minimal quantity of individuals, is true fans. What I'm finding really interesting about, or what I'm really finding interesting in what's coming through, is how there's this perception of death of the follower, perhaps a sense that what has been experienced as a following is in a stage, if you will, of decay. And perhaps that has a lot of correlation with the advent of what he's describing as the social networking platforms catering more to gaining attention and keeping people engaged on their platforms. And so the way that they structure their algorithms is not necessarily advantageous, if you will, to the creator's maintenance of a following, because it's not necessarily promoting the creator's content and artwork to the people specifically who made the sort of choice to follow. And so with this advent of shifts in the algorithmic coding and the algorithmic intention and the motivations behind that within the company's structures and just consciousness, if you will, what first started to come through is this perception of follower, and how follower tends to, at least in a first sort of default association with the word follower, there tends to be this perception of a hierarchical relationship. It's like when you follow someone, when you follow something, you're following behind it. There's also this other perception of following where there's just simply enjoyment of the presence of someone or something, if you will. I know, not every time. Often when I do these recordings, I'm like, Jesus, am I even going to keep any of this? There's so many different kinds of following, and I guess that's the thing, is there's a shift. Ultimately, it feels like there's a shift in the perception of following, and there's a reflection on that experience, or there's a sense, an emerging sense, that the experience of following, in whatever capacity that is experienced, whatever sort of diverse experience of following there is, it's a shift in perception that equals the playing field, because it's like there's an emerging awareness that no one is better than anyone else. Everyone is human. Everyone has their faults. Everyone makes mistakes. No one is perfect. That kind of perception, and I'm not saying that in an absolutist sense, because there is much deeper awareness within those perceptions and within those reflections of oneself. But setting that aside for a moment, that awareness equals the playing field, so that no matter who you're experiencing reality with, whether it's in a physical sense or over the internet, if you will, it's like there's this growing awareness emerging from within the human experience that equalizes the playing field, regardless of opinions, regardless of locality, regardless of culture, regardless of age, regardless of gender, regardless of economic status. And so within that relationship, within that growing relationship, within that emerging relationship, perhaps it is the death of the follower. Because on that sort of equal playing field, there isn't really that same quality of experience in terms of following. Perhaps there is still a quality of following in a sense of collaborating in a shared experience where there is together following a sort of mutual direction, a mutual sort of inspired, imaginative idea, intuitive feeling. And so that was kind of the first thing that was coming through. And then then there was also, as I continued watching this video, there was another thought coming through, a thought stream coming through about, okay, well that feels like it has a little bit more correlation with the follower. But then there's another sort of perceptual shift with the creator and how the creator sort of perceives the relationship with a following. And so that too contributes to this quote-unquote death of the follower. It's not just a death of what is sort of perceived and labeled and projected onto this sort of externalized unit. It also is correlated and related to the creator who is intimately and inextricably connected with that unit. So it's interesting to think about these shifts in relationships and the infrastructure that is underlying and really fundamental to the emergent, perhaps new sort of quote-unquote phenotype that could possibly develop within the context of internet networking and internet connecting. And so how will that internet connecting and networking appear and be structured when the perception within our relationships, the fundamental infrastructure of our relationships with ourselves and with each other is an equal playing field, which that equal playing field also, again, kind of reminded me of that line where life and death touch. That line where all paradox touches, the same two sides of the same coin. And what will that shifting infrastructure, perceptual infrastructure, and structures of relationships, how will that birth the appearance and the sort of physical and digital landscape of how we interact with one another? So after that really long-winded, okay, so I like what I did last time, so I think if I do it from here, like that.
I don't think that this is going to happen. I think the follow is too important to die. I think it's too valuable to ignore. I think it's too useful and awesome for creative people, for publishers, for media companies. And I think the next wave of internet and media technology companies are going to surge on this problem and try to solve it. And it's actually already started. And the incumbent social platforms, they're not going to be able to fight it because their revenue relies on maximizing attention. To drive their businesses, they're being forced.
I know sort of what I was going to say before too, in terms of the perception of the creator in correlation with having a following. That goes back to what he talks about earlier in this video regarding the desire for reaching people, reaching an audience. And this is something that came up yesterday and something I was reading. It is just this desire, this very intense desire that I have experienced within myself. So there's something about that perception. There's a lot about that perception. But to simply just focus for the moment on the aspect of that perception that sort of falls away when you experience reality and experience relationships with one another on that equal playing field, where it's not so much about feeling this need to reach people. And I wonder if a lot of that need is because of a feeling within oneself of lack of being heard, perhaps feeling to some degree, and a lot of this is largely subconscious, feeling abandoned, or feeling a sense of abandonment and not belonging. And so that need, and that need also being attributed to some sense of financial security, some sense of security at all in oneself, in the economic landscape, because a lot of creators, and I don't want to speak in a complete generalization and put words in people's mouth, but from observance of myself and others, there is a feeling and a sense as though a lot of that need to reach people is very intimately related to financial insecurity within the economic landscape, because the sense of being a creator is also perceived as the professional, or the means, if you will, of making money, of supporting oneself financially. And so there's this need that is rooted in this perceptual, experiential lack of security in relationship with others, relationship with oneself, the institutions within the current sort of economic, political landscape, etc., etc., etc. And so when there's this evil, Freudian slip, when there is that equal playing field, and that perception and that experience is what one is grounded within and experiencing in their reality predominantly. And it's not about need per se. That inquiry could potentially very dramatically shift the way that relationships form over the internet and in person. And the relationships as they form in person and over the internet are less about having a following.
Up towards discovery, towards reach, personalization, algorithmic curation. These are the levers that drive attention, and therefore they drive their strategies. That's why there's a hole already opening up, and why we're starting to see a whole new set of companies emerge that look fundamentally different from the legacy social landscape. Discord and Kajabi and Fourth Wall and Gumroad, Moment, which Patreon acquired last year, the courses platforms, events companies. Some people are calling this subset of companies the creator economy. I don't even think of it like that. It's a fundamental shift in approach. And the hallmark strategy of the drivers of these businesses is the focus on deeper connections as opposed to just more connections. And what binds this new wave of emerging companies is that their strategic focus is down here. The next decade of creative and media technology companies will focus on building direct-to-fan connections and community strength. How community and art exists on the web. I don't think it's the right way. And I want Patreon to contribute to building a better version of how art and community could exist on the internet. We've oriented the whole company around this problem. We're now thinking of Patreon no longer as a membership platform, but as this whole thing. The media, community, and business foundation for the next decade of professional creativity on the internet, organized around the concept of the true follow in an effort to build a better way that art can exist on the web. As a creator on the internet today, I get subscribers and I can get views, and if I can send my fans to Instagram or TikTok and they can be there, but what I've noticed is those communities degrade over time. They don't get energized over time, they get de-energized. It gets harder and harder to reach those people. I make a post, I reach 2% of my audience, I reach 1% of my audience. I lose touch with those people, and there's no way for me to find those real fans, those true fans, the small portion of my fans that drive everything for me as a creator. The way we're building this and what I want as a creator is a place where
Some of that too feels a lot like there's a dependence on the sort of structures of the internet to deliver a message. So there's this dependence on the middleman, if you will. There's this dependence on the platform to reach the audience. Some of that to me feels like it's not giving credit to those who are subscribed, those who have consciously intended to share in the experience of that which is being expressed. And it's partly I don't know if I necessarily say the responsibility, but it is a responsibility for those who have made that conscious intention to quote unquote follow up on it. Take response, be able to respond, be able to, I'm hesitating because I could use words and frame this such as the responsibility is on the follower to continue checking up with the video channel, the creator's channel. And if the audience members are not checking up on the channel, then it's their fault. They should be the ones checking up on it. Why is it the responsibility of the platform to do it for them? That's just another convenience. I could easily say it that way. And perhaps there is an aspect of me that wants to say it that way. There's an aspect of me that has said and framed expressions in that way regularly at prior moments in my life. And I say prior because this is an intention of mine. It's an intention to be very mindful and conscious of the words that I use because of the desire to frame expression in a way that feels aligned within myself and a sense of integrity. Align with that and grounded in that. And so the intention here is to acknowledge that that perception, that expression that I just shared, exists within myself. I acknowledge it. I don't intend to reject it. It's just that when I go through the exercise of contemplation and reflection and introspection, the intention is to acknowledge and integrate and listen to whether that feels like how the expression desires to be articulated. And it's not in an absolutist sense, in a sense of totality, in a sense of wholeness. And so, as it is one way to express, it is not the only way to express. And so that is the expression, the expression that articulates and frames it in a way that feels in accordance with how I am guided, if you will. What feels like I can say next step, the forward movement, sort of the forward progress, I hesitate to say best. I hesitate to say correct. I know I've used that terminology before. So here, there is an element here, and there is an aspect within the relationship of, to just frame it how it is currently, creator and following, creator and audience. There is an aspect of this relationship that in which the response regarding a shared creation, the response to that creation, regardless of what platform, the response to that creation is within the sort of purview, the jurisdiction, if you will, of the audience members. And so to have this sort of dependence, I don't want to necessarily say solely, but this dependence, this need for a platform to do that, to sort of take away, if you will, that jurisdictional authority, is largely what we're seeing in governmental bodies. We've been seeing that, we've been experiencing this type of convenience, if you will, for generations, if not way longer than that. That is what is shifting. That outsourcing of sort of one's inherent jurisdictional authority to respond to experiences and expressions within their reality, that is the outsourcing of that is being reined in. That is what is being reined in. So it's interesting to see how the Supreme Court is also going through this experience of reining in. Now, that's not to say one way or the other whether it's right or wrong, or there's agreement or disagreement with it. It's just interesting. That sort of is almost a macrocosmic example of this symptomatic desire to rein back in power that has been given away, that has been overextended. And the same thing is sort of happening a little bit microcosmically within the individual experience. So it's very interesting to see how this is all playing out within the sort of technological, social media, networking, just internet in general. I hear what he's saying here, and perhaps this is an aspect, what he's describing is perhaps an aspect of how this underlying fundamental sort of inner infrastructural change is shifting the landscape of the internet. However, it doesn't feel to me as though it is a be-all, end-all. It feels more to me like a stepping stone, if even that.
I can send my fans, and that fandom gets energy over time. That fandom gets closer. That fandom gets more vibrant, more connected over time, more enthusiastic over time. That's what I want as a creator. That's the space that I want to have as a creative person. Okay, we also acquired a live experiences platform called Moment, and I don't even want to call it ticketed live streaming because it's not. It's so much more beautiful than that. Arjun and the team did such an incredible job building this place for creators to sell tickets to these live experiences, and they can debut their work. A stand-up special, a movie that they've made, a special episode that they know is going to be a total banger. Whatever it is, it allows creators to sell tickets to that experience, and then have community with those fans while they're all watching it.
I also just want to say really quickly that I am very grateful for the opportunity, the availability, the accessibility to platforms that do sort of play this middleman role. The intention is not to reject them outright. There is intense appreciation and gratitude for the role, if you will, that they play in the process of this emergence. And so I'm feeling very grateful that they exist, that they are experiences within this reality. It's interesting and it's exciting to see how they evolve over time, and the intentionality and motivations that are being expressed, and of which there is some degree of transparency. And so I do just want to acknowledge that.
All that to say, the way we're thinking about this next phase is that we're not just a membership company anymore. We're a true fan company. We're a creator company. We're building a better way for art and community to exist on the internet. Because I want Patreon to build an internet where creators have true creative freedom, control of their businesses and their careers, and I want it to feel like fire to be part of a creator's community. I believe this in my bones. It is not a choice, it's not optimism, it's just deep down what I actually know to be available to humanity if that is the path that we choose. Invest in those true fans. Invest in the depth of connection, not just new. It's not all about new views, new subscribers, watch time up and to the right. It's about depth. It's about quality of interaction. Make beautiful things. There is so much tension, especially right now, to make for the algorithm. And I've seen the diagrams, I've seen the charts, I've even drawn them in my Instagram. You know, make for the algorithm, make for yourself, and then you make the things that help you build a business, and you sort of do this Venn diagram, the little center part, and that's the sweet spot. I've seen all that. And I get that. But the gravity, everywhere we look as creators today, the gravity is just pushing us. It's just pushing us toward making for other reasons than why we set out to make things in the first place. It's so important to remember to make beautiful things, to make things that light you up, and to make things that you care about. Know what you want. The hardest lesson I have learned as a creative person and as an operator and CEO is to know and trust what I want and to be true to that over time. That's easier said than done. Don't let somebody else tell you what you want, because then you'll end up with what they want instead of what you want. A good example of that is as creators, we open up our dashboards and we see these metrics on what success is. This is a dashboard that someone else built for us, and it tells us what we want. And the weird thing is, after a couple of years, we start to believe that. Like, our minds get reprogrammed, and we believe this is what I want. This is success, and we chase that. But I can tell you what I want as an artist. I can tell you what matters to me as a creative person, and what I know will matter to me 10 years ago, now, and 10 years from now. I want to say something that matters to somebody. I want to say something that only I can say because of whatever experience I've had in my lived experience, something that is uniquely pointed to me. I want to say that. I want to figure out how to say that. I want to find that core of human truth in my experience and communicate it eloquently and clearly and have it be true and feel true and have someone else see that and have that person think, yes, that feels true, and it feels true to them. And then I want that person to feel connected to me even though we've never met before in our lives. But I said a thing that resonated with them and made them feel a little bit less alone because they felt like there was another person who had that same experience. I want to make things that are timeless. I want to make things that feel true now. I want to make things that feel true in 50 years. I want to make things that still feel true 500 years after I'm dead. I want to figure out how to use my short years on this planet to find that kind of truth and say it. That's what I want as an artist. And that's a very different goal than watch time. That may not be what you want as an artist, and that's okay. But the point is to...
There's something really interesting about this, and I would be a hypocrite if I said I did not experience this. There's this desire for that innate connection to one another to express as clearly evidential in some capacity, a proof or validity, confirmation that I have been heard, that the message I have has been heard, and that you understand it, that you get it, that it resonates with you, that you feel what I'm putting down, if you, that you're picking up what I'm putting down. I just question, is that all that it's about? Is that the only way that the innate sense of connectivity can express in a way that feels fulfilling and satisfying. Because in a way, it still kind of feels like that fulfillment and that satisfaction is externalized. When that fulfillment and that satisfaction is self-generated, that sort of projected and externalized sense and desire for fulfillment and satisfaction kind of dissolves. And that's not to say that a feeling of connectivity dissolves with it. The feeling of connectivity actually feels more deeply accessible and tangible because it's innate within the experience with one another. It's more sort of easily, effortlessly, I don't want to keep using the word experienced, but it's deeply known. It's deeply felt effortlessly. And so that reaching out for another to give that sense of fulfillment and satisfaction within one's expression, or because of one's expression, or for one's expression, related to one's expression, that dissolves. And it feels to me, and it seems to me through observance, that that dissolution, that dissolving of reliance and projected externalism is being glimpsed now, currently. It's currently being glimpsed. Those glimpses will become more and more and more and more, perhaps until that numerical sense within the innate human species, if not beyond, will activate the emergence of that embodied awareness to an extent that perhaps the egoic sense of itself and sort of cognitive mental capacities can't fathom.
Know what you want, what matters to you. What are you trying to achieve as a creative person? We have this tendency to look outside for those answers. I do it too. This advice is honestly more for me than it is for anybody else in this room. We want there to be a Yoda. We want there to be a leader or a manager or a voice of authority that can tell us what we want, because it's a scary thing to ask. But that does not exist. What we want comes intrinsically, not extrinsically. It comes from in here. That's where we find it. So as we navigate this next phase of the internet as creative people, as we go through these ups and downs of the web in its ever-evolving state, do not forget what matters to you as an artist. Do not forget what fills you with pride to make. Do not forget your purpose for making things in the first place. Don't forget why you wake up in the morning and devote your time and energy to your craft. Don't forget what gives you a sense of meaning as a creative person. And lastly, don't forget to scream your fucking guts out. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Very interesting very nicely said to sort of bring it all home. Okay. It's raining outside. I don't know if that's picking up on camera, but it is a bit darker in atmosphere. So in the last video, there were a couple points, a couple notes I made to myself for further research, further exploration. A couple things that kind of piqued my interest, kind of piqued my curiosity, that didn't really feel fitting for that particular compilation. And so I was intending to go back to them. And so I'm starting off with this question I left for myself, which was around going back to so here in Troy, going back to the the amended legislation that was introduced in the most recent city council meeting. And the most recent city council meeting was July 25th, if I'm remembering correctly. At that meeting, the administration introduced through the city council this amended language that is Chapter 72, creating the planning board. So in this amended language, it was brought up during that meeting, during that meeting on the 25th, there was inquiry around the appointment of city employees to the council or to the planning board, and whether that specific language implicated ethical considerations, specifically in regard to whether city employees appointed to the planning board were inherently at conflict of interest, or that role would inherently open up questions around conflict of interest inherently. And so the question I sort of had for myself was whether that particular language in regard to the appointment of city employees, if that language was included in the original proposed language from the July 11th City Council meeting, when the first iteration of the planning board was introduced. At least first iteration within the context of this particular administration and city council. So I wasn't clear on whether the appointment of city employees was part of the first iteration of the planning board creation language, or whether that was part of the amendment which was introduced this past meeting on July 25th. And in leaning into this, I'm inviting recall. I'm inviting conscious recall around why this particular question stood out to me at the time I was exploring this within the last compilation, because as I'm sitting here reviewing my notes, I am sort of pulling a blank on why that struck me in the first, why that struck me at all. I feel as though it perhaps had something to do with the notion that, let me backtrack for a second. In the Record article that covered this city council meeting on July 25th, it was an article titled, quote, "We heard." And that was a quote, I believe, of the mayor, implying that the public comments that were prolific during the initial council meeting when all of this sort of emerged, and the council meeting immediately following that, I believe 2 weeks later, there were so many comments that the mayor was implying were heard. And so in hearing public comments, that's a lot of why there were amendments to the language in the first place. And so I feel as though I found it interesting how the language to appoint city officials was added at all. And so the inquiry came in. I wonder if this language was initially in there or if this was part of the amended sort of inspiration, if you will, or inspired amending. And if it was part of this latter amendment process, why was that in particular included? Because I don't recall any conversation around that included within the public commentary or the commentary of the city council. And so I'm not quite sure how that came into the picture. So that was the first thing I wanted to look into and see what wants to come through there. Because, I mean, just as a sort of side note, I've kind of picked up a little bit in my own process, or at least I've reflected on my process in a way that has kind of illuminated how anytime there is something that really grabs my interest, anytime there is something that really grabs my curiosity, as small and benign as it may appear on the surface, and as much as I may doubt it in the moment, like, oh, that doesn't really seem that important or significant, you know, to the egoic sense of self's perception of what appears to be happening here, I have started to move beyond that initial doubt, because even in those moments where I have had that initial doubt speak even stronger and louder, there more often than not, and I hesitate to say always, but there more often than not emerges an expression, an aspect of awareness, a perception that the cognitive mind just couldn't, at least in that moment, and even in saying it now, there couldn't have been, well, maybe I shouldn't say couldn't, but the almost, it just seems too well placed, if you will, in the sort of flow and process of this. So let's just see. Let's see what we find. Maybe it'll be, who knows? I don't know. We're just following the little trail, the little hippity hoppity rabbit trail. Seeing what goodies we find. Sharing my screen. I'm gonna start sharing my screen. Right. Okay, so Troy, city council agenda. Let's do a little comparison, shall we? Okay, so the amendments were introduced July 25th. I haven't actually read the full language of the amended ordinance. Oh, you know what? Excuse me, it wasn't July 25th. I hope. What did I say? It was August 1st. I might have misspoken in saying July 25th. If I did, I meant August 1st. Dates, man. Okay, so we got that one. Then it was originally the 11th. 11, 11, 11. So here we've got on the right August 1st agenda, and on the left we've got the July 11th agenda. Both ordinances, both to add a chapter 72. So let's go to the language in the coconut. Okay. Oops. Okay, so right off the bat, I see one addition. I mean, we have the addition up here, but this looks different. Yeah, so there's quite a bit of amended language here, even just in added sections. Interesting, okay. Oh, okay, never mind. That's actually in there. Never mind, okay. That's new. Maybe, yeah, okay, now I'm remembering. It also had something to do with a county official. So all this language appears added. I don't see that language in the previous version. So any municipal official serving on the board shall not, by reason of membership thereon, forfeit the right to exercise the powers, perform the duties, or receive the compensation of their municipal office during such membership. So that was in the previous version. But then it goes on to say, but no municipal officer or employee shall be appointed to the planning board if performance of the duties of his or her position will conflict with the performance of his or her duties as a member of the board. no person shall be disqualified from serving as a member of the city planning board by reason of serving as a member of a county planning board. I do remember that being brought up. The City Council may make such appropriation as it deems fit for planning board expenses, including the compensation of planning board members. The planning board shall have the power and authority to employ experts, clerks, and a secretary, blah, blah, blah. That actually might have been in the previous version. It may have just been... I remember there being something about expenses. Oh, here. The board shall have the power and authority to employ experts, clerks, and a secretary, blah, blah, blah. I had looked into appropriation in one of the videos. Oh, it was another Supreme Court case that had to do with appropriation. I'll look back at that. As far as I see currently, the previous version actually called for the board preparing an annual budget for expenses. I don't know that that's in this amended language, preparing a budget. I don't see it in this appropriations section. Okay, so as far as I can see, there's no mention of alternates in the initial language. That's kind of odd. The training required by this subdivision may be waived or modified by resolution of the City Council when, in the judgment of the Council, it is in the best interest of the city to do so. That's bizarre. Why? Why was that added in there? Wow. Failure to attend 2 or more consecutively scheduled meetings or non-attendance at 3 or more meetings in a calendar year. That's almost like, I mean, I understand that the intention is for the board to meet monthly, theoretically 1 to 2 times a month. So I suppose if you miss 3 meetings out of either 12 meetings a year and or 24 meetings a year, missing 3 meetings out of 20, theoretically, perhaps at least 24 meetings, or even, to say the least, 12 meetings. Missing 3 out of 12 meetings. I mean, I guess that is a quarter of the meetings. There's something that just kind of strikes me as severe. Especially when it seems so black and white. 3 is 3. No extenuating circumstances allowed. I know it says shall be cause. The mayor doesn't necessarily have to remove the board member if they miss 3 or more meetings in a calendar year. But that just seems overboard. Overboard. There you go. Any member of the board may be removed by the mayor for cause after written notice and public hearing. That addresses what I and many others commented about with regard to not only the initial language of this code, but in responding to how this process emerged in the first place with regard to the planning commissioners. It's kind of weird also how cause includes failure to complete mandatory training requirements, but the training requirements can be waived. So it's sort of like they're significant for board appointment, but they're also not significant enough that they're not even really mandatory because they can be waived. They're sort of conditional. It's a conditional requirement. Yeah, hold on, this is an interesting shift in language. May. So in the amended language, the City Council may adopt any such rules and regulations recommended by the Planning Board. Whereas in the initial language, it was shall. Shall. With the advice of the board, the City Council shall adopt rules and regulations. In the amendment, the City Council may. It's not required to. Although actually, now that I say that, it still says shall. Okay. A bit confusing. The board shall have the full power and authority to make investigations, maps, reports, and recommendations in connection with a proposed city comprehensive plan or amendment thereto relating to the planning and development of the city, provided that the total expenditures of the board shall not exceed the appropriation therefor. That language, as far as I can see, is not in the initial language, and the reason it's interesting to me is because the only language in the initial proposal that regarded the board's authority to employ was this language here in 72-4D. The board shall have the power and authority to employ experts, clerks, and a secretary, and to pay for their services and such other expenses as may be necessary and proper, and shall prepare an annual budget for such purpose, not exceeding in all the annual appropriation that may be approved by the city council. Actually, that reminds me again about the appropriation case that I was referencing before. The annual part. There was something in the Supreme Court case about the annual appropriation of Congress to a federal agency. Anyway, okay, I'll go back to it. But I guess the reason this is striking me is because the amended language focuses more, specifically on sort of documentation more so than personnel. So here they're talking about, or just actions, I suppose, make investigations, maps, reports, and recommendations in connection with the city comprehensive plan. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure why that's sticking out to me, except I suppose that it's different. Dana. Okay, so the appointment of employees then, to answer my question, it seemed like they actually already had that language. Okay, any municipal official serving on the board. So in the initial proposal, there was language regarding a city official, a city employee serving on the board. It was just that it couldn't be more than a minority of positions. Okay, so it was in there. But really what was added, at least in this particular specific context, is first of all about conflict, but also about the accessibility for county planning board members to also serve on the Troy City Planning Board. And I suppose the question being, is that a conflict?
Hi, Otis. Hi, Tissy.
So I'm just sitting here watching the Troy City Council meeting tonight, and it's so interesting to me what topics are being discussed. I looked at the agenda about an hour or so before the meeting, and nothing really struck me, including the ordinance regarding the planning board amendments. So I was gonna watch it when it came on, and I've been watching it, and turns out that the public is bringing back into the back to the attention of the council, if it wasn't already present, the issue, if you will, around the lead pipes. And it's so interesting to me. There was another earlier discussion that was on the agenda that had to do with a development proposal on some, I believe, large parcel of property. And there was a question brought up by the chair of the council regarding the public-private distinction in terms of maintenance of roads. And this is something that I have discussed, or at least I've touched on in a previous video, and I don't recall exactly which one that is, but if I can find it, I will try to link it here. The interesting thing about that and how that connects to the lead pipes is that the lead pipes, and the reason why there seems to be a holdup or a contention around the timeliness of the action being taken on it, is because of a contention or a dispute around, or just the city not being clear, the city not having a clear green light to apply bond money to lead pipes that are on private property. And so there is this private public line that a lot of officials are not willing to cross the line on without having some kind of official formalized approval in writing by the state of New York. And I don't know what the state of New York's position is on this, if they're even intending to address it at any point in the sort of quote unquote near future, or now, presently, currently. But what's so fascinating to me about this is I was just sitting here sort of wondering what an alternative would be. And it seems like, first of all, the attorney who just spoke was the gentleman attorney who I have mentioned before. Rick Morrissey is his name. And he was talking about how no bond attorney would sign off on the city bonding for replacement of the lead pipes on private property because the attorney doesn't have that green light. And so if the attorney doesn't have that green light, they don't want to be personally liable should, as far as I can understand it, there come down some kind of ruling or opinion that from the state that it's unconstitutional according to the state constitution. And in addition, if the city does bond for it, if somehow the city did bond for it with the approval of the bond attorney, then it's possible that if it was claimed as unconstitutional, or even not, I suppose, yet, it's very possible that the state of New York would not grant the city of Troy reimbursement for those bonded funds. So the city of Troy feels like it's in this between a rock and a hard place, wants to replace the pipes, but doesn't feel like it has that approval. It doesn't feel like it has that authority, and is uncomfortable to do so because of, I suppose, personal risk and financial quote unquote ruin is the word coming to me. But what I was just thinking is, what would happen if there was a figure put on, an estimate, I know, but a figure put on all the lead piping that has to be replaced in Troy, whether it's public or private land, all of it, all of the piping, what is the cost of that? And is it possible to look into the city's budget? And I know the city of Troy doesn't have a comptroller right now, but is it possible to look into the budget and to inquire into how, if at all, is it possible to include and budget for this cost in the budget as it currently sits? And I understand that that may mean it's I can never say this word, amortized over several years. And quite honestly, I don't even know that that's possible, because as I'm talking about this, I'm like, I think there was an issue with carrying budgetary deficits forward to the following year. So I'm not an accountant. I don't know. I'm not a CPA. I'm not familiar with the process in terms of city budgets, but maybe this is a completely irrelevant thought process, but I was just thinking, why can't it be possible that the city budgets for this over the stretch of perhaps several years, if that's what it takes, and there is just communication with the citizens around what this means for the budget? And maybe it means that certain aspects of the budget are reconsidered. Maybe there are creative ways to go about a budget, I don't know, in a city, but I just feel like there are ways to consider, or there are ways to kind of get going on this, to work through not having an okay from the state, not needing to rely on the state for an okay, not needing to rely on them for funding, figuring it out within ourselves. And I don't feel like that's impossible. I just feel like it takes a lot more transparency, a lot more communication, and so, I don't know, maybe you don't need what is perceived as needed, that there are alternatives that are creative and that I don't know. Anyway. Okay, so I wanted to quickly kind of look into who is currently sitting on the county planning board. So the county here is the Rensselaer County. The county is Rensselaer. I honestly didn't even know that there was a county board, a county planning board. So it was something I thought about after the last recording. And so I wanted to take a look to see who was actually on the planning board, just out of pure curiosity. Doo-da-doo-doo-doo-dee. Let's check out the Rensselaer Planning Board. Is there a planning board? Okay, Rensselaer County. Planning and Development and Planning? A county planning board. Okay. A county planning board. Not necessarily just Rensselaer, then? confusing. Okay, Rensselaer County Planning Agency. It's not the city of Rensselaer. Yeah, Planning Committee. Interesting. They're in Troy. I think Bob is actually, he is someone I have met before because I used to attend the Rensselaer County Industrial Development Agency public meetings. And he was, I believe, the chair of those meetings. Interesting. I had no idea this was there. Where is this? Huh. Okay. Rensselaer County Government Center. I mean, I've passed this building often. I never thought twice about it. Yeah, so this building down here, right here, this bigger building is demolished, and they're building a whole new structure that probably will look something like this. I wonder if this is part of RPI. Oh, interesting. Okay, fire alarm, telegraph, and police signaling building. This must be a really old Google map because I believe this building was also demolished, which is quite... anyway, I think that building isn't there anymore. Okay, clearly I'm in a mood. Okay, I don't even see... I literally don't see anything about this board. Interesting. To keep meeting sizes to workable numbers, the planning committee will be broken up into a core planning group and a series of jurisdictional assessment teams. It doesn't say anything about who are on these boards or anything currently anyway. I actually am wondering now if it's not so much that there is a county planning board member that there is intention to include in the city of Troy's planning board, but actually if it's possible that someone who is currently on the planning board or who is appointed to the planning board then being included in this planning committee of the county. The CPG, or the core planning group, includes head members of the participating jurisdictional assessment teams. The CPG will include representatives of Rensselaer County and any of the county's jurisdictions who elect to participate in the process. Yeah, I mean, it seems like, okay, so elected and appointed government officials, business leaders, volunteers of nonprofit organizations, citizens, and other stakeholders who choose to participate will become part of our overall Rensselaer County multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation planning committee. I am not certain whether this planning committee is the same that is intended as the language in this amended city board language that says no person shall be disqualified from serving as a member of the city planning board by reason of serving as a member of a county planning board. So a county doesn't necessarily mean only Rensselaer County. And if it is Rensselaer County, Rensselaer has this interesting sort of top-down structure to its membership, which is broken up into a core planning group, CPG, and a series of jurisdictional assessment teams, JAT. I don't know. I don't know what the intention is here. For all I know, it could have nothing to do with Rensselaer County. But it sounds like it could also be bottom up, if you will. The intention being for someone on the current city planning board, or who is going to be appointed to the city planning board, having them also have some kind of official capacity in a county sense. County not necessarily limited to just Rensselaer. Okay, so we're going to do something a little bit cray-cray here. We're going to muse and reflect through a prior video that I did. I had originally uploaded it as unlisted on June 5th. So that's going on a little tiny bit over a month ago was when this was uploaded. I don't recall exactly when specifically I recorded this part of the video, but it's the video is a multidimensional interpretive dance, and the segment that I'm about to reflect through is regarding a Supreme Court case that was assessing the Congress's, it was really assessing the appropriations. It's not Appropriations Act, and it's not statute. It's the Appropriations Clause, thank you. The Appropriations Clause. So the Supreme Court was assessing Congress's appropriations to a specific federal agency. And quite honestly, I don't remember the context of this case other than it had to do with the appropriations clause. But the reason I wanted to look into this again and reflect through this particular video was because when I was looking yesterday at the City of Troy's amended planning board language, part of what I became aware of in reading that language that I hadn't at all been consciously aware of prior to that point, because I don't recall it being talked about in the city council meeting about these amendments, was language about appropriations for this planning board and its expenditures. And so when I was reading this language about appropriations in the amended language, it reminded me about this particular Supreme Court case that I had reflected on a month ago. And it was interesting to me how in the planning board amendment language, not only was the language about the need to sort of submit a budget to the city council was removed, so that language about a budget was removed. It also included it appeared that there was more of a broad ability for the city council to appropriate funds than previously. And also in appropriating those funds, the expenditures for the planning board also seemed more broad. So not only was it regarding personnel that the planning board is entitled to call in, but it also applied to certain documentation that the planning board is now authorized to craft, if you will, or to just initiate. And so I just wanted to look back on this case and see what was being talked about with the appropriations specifically. Also because, interestingly, and this is something that I saw come up several weeks ago, also in this context of the Planning Commission transitioning into the Planning Board, and how there was a very interesting timing of this happening now, 6 months after the mayor's administration began. And it was timing in regard to a Supreme Court case that was reining in the perceived overextension of power. And I'm not recalling at this particular moment exactly what that context was, except I do believe it had to do with another federal agency and reining in the power of that federal agency. Okay, reining in the power of that federal agency to interpret. I believe this was the context in which I said the timing is very interesting, and if I can find that clip, I will insert it here. It's interesting because I'm noticing, or I'm just sort of contemplating back to policy. I'm contemplating policy, decision making, and sort of personal preference, interpretation, and it's interesting to juxtapose the court case about Chevron deference with this current project here in Troy, especially the timing, which I hadn't picked up on prior to right now, about how the city and its desire to repeal the Planning Commission and replace it with a board and citing the inefficiency and dysfunctionality of the commission because of its practice of policy making and its practice of founding decisions on personal preference and several other aspects, several other reasons. But I just thought to myself, it's interesting timing how the Supreme Court case about Chevron deference came out within the last, couple of months, several weeks. And it's now that the administration is proposing the repeal of the Planning Commission when the mayor has been in office for 6 months. So in thinking more about this, I said to myself just now, that's also kind of interesting in the timing, knowing that in the Chevron deference case, the Supreme Court was reining back in the perceived authority and the authority in practice that the federal agencies had been applying, reining that back in to the court, basically to say, no, the court has ultimate jurisdiction over interpretation, and especially where there is ambiguity. Maybe not especially, but definitely where there is ambiguity. This particular case with the appropriations also sparked a thought that the timing was very interesting. The timing of this appropriations being very interesting, kind of coming off the heels of this Supreme Court case that came down perhaps within the last 2 months, although if I can get an exact date on that, I will. So I wanted to go back over that. This is a little bit of a newer experience to reflect on a prior video that I've done, using sort of myself as a muse in this way. So we'll see. I also noticed that I'm wearing red in this video and in the prior video, so red, consistency. Okay, so let's see what we got. The reason this case struck me in particular is not so much because of the particular context, the substance of this case, but more so in the Record article I read yesterday reporting on the ruling. Specifically, it was highlighting commentary of Justice Thomas and his interpretation of the law in this case was grounded in a strict sort of textual reading of the Constitution from the time period that it was written, right? So it's not only just sort of strict textual interpretation, but also the history. What meaning is historically relevant at the time the text was ratified in the middle of a larger picture story? And that's for anyone, that's for anything, I suppose. A lot of how we've related to the world and how we've related to other people and how we've organized our social systems and infrastructures is through this lens, through this perspective of a rather fixed beginning and a rather fixed end, and looking at our lives in a way that feels so complete, so to speak, or not really complete, but bookended. Not really quite sure how else to put it at the moment, but what's interesting is spiritual interpretation, and really any of these other lenses of interpretation, facilitate a more expansive deeper contextual view. Anyway, I suppose what I'm getting at is just that all of these different lenses of interpretation really facilitate a deeper contextual picture, or they showcase a deeper contextual picture than simply what is sort of more narrowly perceived as a complete book-ended narration and point of reflection. There is so much more that can be explored, so much more that can be inquired. You know what? This is actually really interesting too, because I was just reading in a book about Bitcoin that I just started. There is a really interesting reference to the origination of sort of a public, consolidated, centralized bank from the Medici period in Italy. And it seemed to me when I was reading this that perhaps a lot of why there was support from the crown for a centralized bank system was so that the crown itself would have this trusting system, or this trustworthy system that it would be in control of, in recognizing whether or not the exchange of financial resources that it was overseeing was legitimate, that those funds would come back to the crown, that whoever they're making arrangements with would have the financial resources to pay the crown, and that the crown wasn't going to go bankrupt or what have you. So this was just a thought I had. I don't know specifically whether there is... I don't know why, but for some reason that's kind of bringing back this notion about a member of the county planning board, or perhaps committee, being on the city council, or excuse me, the city planning board in Troy. And if there isn't some kind of intentionality, whether it's conscious or subconscious or both, whether there is some kind of intention to reinforce trust that how the city plans will be I don't know what word to it's not the exact same here, but basically that what the city quote unquote needs, and I don't know another way of phrasing it. Is there another way of phrasing what I'm pointing toward, or what's being pointed toward? Yeah, an open channel. Like there's some kind of reinforcement of, there's some kind of intention or attempt to reinforce trust that the channels of operation are open, that the channels of operation are strengthened, are also reinforced perhaps. So in reinforcing trust, there's this reinforcement of the structures that generate trust perceptually and experientially from the point of view of the city. And I'm not saying this in terms of the mayor particularly. I'm not saying this in terms of any one person or any person at all. I'm not intending to say that the city is the mayor, if you will, or the mayor's administration, or any particular person. But what I mean by the city is just that the body of the city, the body that is quote unquote sort of identified as the city, that contains the what's striking me here is that if there is any accuracy in a centralized banking system being sort of rooted and grounded in a perception of distrust, even though it's marketed as a system of trust, because, now we're ensuring that those who are financially contracting with the state are able to pay, that the crown is able to collect from these arrangements. So it's being marketed sort of as a trustworthy pursuit to support trust, to nurture a system of trust and engage in a system of trust. It more so is actually rooted in distrust and seeking to control that sense of distrust, to overcompensate, sort of pun intended, for that sense of distrust that perhaps the crown was experiencing. And so here, in looking, the evidence suggests that at a minimum, appropriations were understood as a legislative means of authorizing expenditures from public funds for designated purposes. It's like that to me still is landing in a groundedness and a rootedness in distrust. There has to be this legislative oversight, this controlling mechanism in place so that what appears as trust, what appears as a safeguard of public funds, is actually more a control mechanism for the centralized power to designate the flow of how that money received through the public is expended, how it is directed. The other interesting thing about this is it's bringing up the sort of reflection on bonding, also from a couple videos ago. And I don't quite understand the bonding process enough so the evidence suggests that at a minimum, appropriations were understood as a legislative means of authorizing expenditures from public funds for designated purposes. I don't quite understand why. So in last night's city council meeting, the gentleman attorney, Rick Morrissey, I believe, if I remember correctly, made certain points that the legislature could pass/adopt an ordinance to bond for the replacement of lead pipes. They could do that. However, the bonding attorney, in his professional opinion, would never sign off on that, which I guess is necessary for the attorney to do that, for those bonds to actually be issued. And then theoretically, if those bonds were received, or if that funding was received, I don't really understand how that bond money is any different from what is considered quote-unquote public funds. Is it considered public funds? Or is it considered somehow private? Because I suppose bonding is putting up private money with the incentive of perhaps receiving interest and possibly dividends, but with also the intention that that money be reimbursed to the funder. So I suppose in that way, perhaps it's not like public funds that Congress appropriates. That's not sort of being reimbursed to the public, if you will. So I suppose there's a little bit of a differentiation there. And maybe I just answered my own question. I'm not really sure, because it seemed to me like with the bonding, even if the city council had the money to designate for that specific purpose, maybe them not being considered public funds sort of sets them into their own sort of category. So perhaps I just answered my own question, or something else will come up about that, or I'm totally off. It's interesting too, because this is saying here, the proviso, I don't know how to pronounce this word, proviso, limiting Congress's power to, quote, raise and support armies, end quote, that no appropriation of money to that use, shall be for a longer term than 2 years. It is highlighting the specific use and saying the Constitution, basically, the Constitution indicates that appropriations assign funds for specific uses, but then it's saying the Constitution does not explicitly limit the duration of appropriations for other purposes. So it's basically saying there has to be specific uses, even though this one only references raising armies. And it doesn't specifically limit the duration of appropriations for other purposes. So it just kind of seems like it's picking and choosing a segment of that quote, the specific purposes, and saying there always has to be a specific purpose, but also at the same time saying, but that doesn't explicitly limit the duration for other purposes. So I guess what I'm trying to say, I know it's a bit confusing the way I'm saying it, or at least I feel like I'm saying it a bit in a confused way, but it's taking a section of the appropriations clause which seems to apply textually, strictly textually, if we're going with that interpretation, it only seems to apply to the specific purpose of raising armies, in which case there is a specific limited duration of appropriations. But they seem to be taking that and stretching the, quote, meaning of that segment, that phrasing, to say, to expand into any specific purpose, but it contracts the duration to not specifically apply. So it's not specifically applying to duration, to limit the duration. However, it is specifically applying to expand expand specific purposes. Just in the substance of the interpretation, not necessarily the lens of it, but the substance of how it's being how Treasury here is being interpreted, is inclusive of surplus funds in the Federal Reserve System would otherwise be deposited into the general fund of the Treasury. Whatever the scope of the term Treasury in the Appropriations Clause, money otherwise destined for the general fund of the Treasury qualifies. I just find that interesting to sort of include in interpreting a concept, quote unquote, or an entity, that they are including that which is destined to be incorporated into that entity. Just find that usage of language interesting. It's just kind of making me think about the diversion of flow again. And I was thinking before I started reading this about how in the sort of well, at least to the conscious cognitive awareness here, that the sort of deepest aspect, or perhaps most expansive aspect of flow, the perception of flow, being that kind of synonymous or analogous to rivers. It just reminds me of when you consume food, and I jokingly often will say, well, it's all going to the same place. And when I was thinking about this before, I thought about that phrase too, and I sort of was like, well, in a way, in a certain dimensional aspect, in regards to flow, could that same phrase be used to say, well, everything ends up in the same place? It's interesting. I don't know if I scroll down a little bit more here. I also don't know if I go over this in any capacity, but I'm just kind of rereading this other paragraph here, and it's interesting in the context of this planning board language. So it says here in this court opinion, the association's challenge turns solely on whether the Bureau's funding mechanism constitutes an appropriations made by law. This question divided the courts below. The district court concluded that a valid appropriation is nothing more than a statute that authorizes an agency to receive funds up to a certain cap. The Court of Appeals, on the other hand, suggested that appropriations must also meet the framers' salutary aims of separating and checking powers and preserving accountability to the people. The associations defend this understanding and argue that the statute that provides the Bureau's funding undermines these aims by allowing the agency to indefinitely choose its own level of annual funding, subject only to an illusory cap. That is, the associations contend that the Bureau's funding mechanism is too open-ended in duration and amount to satisfy the requirement that there be an appropriation made by law. I don't know why this is so interesting to me, because quite honestly, in terms and in the context of the City of Troy Planning Board, this is kind of perhaps perceptually a bit nitpicky. But it's interesting to me how that language surrounding a requirement to submit a budget to the city council was removed. And so that to me sort of removes it removes a designated cap requirement, and kind of feels analogous to this illusory cap, this open-ended in duration and amount. And I don't know, I guess it's just, I don't know. Anyway, if everything, everything's going to the same place, then what really is diversion? It's not diverting the flow per se. Perhaps it's more just getting there a different way, pivoting in direction, but ultimately sort of destined for this moving in the same direction. Or it's not that the direction per se is diverted. It's not that the motion of the flow, the purpose, so to speak, of the flow is diverted. That perhaps has a consistency, a constancy to it. that is rather unchanging, and way beyond how the human sort of egoic sense of self relates with the world and relates with itself and others. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't consistency and constancy in the direction of the flow and sort of its potential purpose, that everything and nothing, but everything is destined to move toward, to be, to experience, to know, to transcend, to become aware of, to let go of. Appropriation here just seems synonymous with direction. These ordinary revenues flowed from many sources, including the rents and profits of the, I don't know what this word is, demesne, lands of the crown, and the fines, forfeitures, and fees arising from the king's ordinary courts of justice. I can see there being some kind of insecurity when inheritance is rooted, grounded, and so reliant upon the financial flow of quote-unquote commoners or the public at the time. And if there is any sense of the crown not receiving their inheritance, not trusting that their inheritance is secured, then I can see there being reason why at the time they would have logically concluded that in order to maintain some semblance of control, to establish some kind of mechanism where there would be a centralized power structure where they would have enforcement ability to enforcement power to reach into the pockets of the public for maintenance of their own sort of expected revenue. Maybe it's not only about not trusting that the public is secure to pay the appropriate, it's interesting how that word's coming out, the appropriate revenue to that sort of makes up the expected royal inheritance, but also if there aren't enough perceived financial resources to engage an army and have the sufficient resources to wage a winning war, a successful war, then perhaps I could see that being another sort of logical reason to conclude that we need to have a centralized system that ensures we have the inheritance that we're owed and the revenues to supply, maintain, create an army. So it's actually kind of interesting thinking about it that way, that the Constitution specifically carves out in its appropriations, it's what's appropriate, the specific mention of creating and sort of supporting an army. Yeah, so extraordinary revenues is like beyond what the crown is sort of expecting as its inheritance revenue, which is also kind of interesting because when you transcend the expectation of what is to be received, you get into a whole other territory of this sort of unexpected revenue generation. And by unexpected, I just mean it's it's not tethered to any sense of containment, so to speak. This is also kind of reminding me again about the bonding, this extraordinary revenue. I know I'm kind of bouncing between the planning board, appropriations and budgeting, and the bonding context. I sort of see them as very interwoven, especially in the framework of this particular opinion. And so here it's talking about these extraordinary revenues, being financed through various forms of taxation and therefore required parliamentary authorization. So bonding is not necessarily equated with a taxation per se, but it is a form of sort of, maybe not even revenue, but governmental financing that requires not parliamentary, but it requires legislative authorization. So if we kind of replace the words here, in granting extraordinary revenues, even just saying the city council exercises an attendant power to specify how the administration used these funds. I know it's a little bit perhaps unfair is the word coming through to flip the words like that, especially because this is not specifically discussing the city council and the administration here, but sometimes it helps me to analogize these contexts when I just sense that there is an analogy and play around with switching out words and particulars and really seeing what how that play informs the sense of analogy. So it leaves it is wide, it's like a wide open landscape, a wide open-ended territory for seemingly boundless collection. Yeah, I mean, it just not only shifted power, but the perception seems to be that Parliament was being relied on. It was heavily being relied on, depended on for financing social infrastructure, social life. Revenue generated through the post office perhaps would be collected and deposited into the federal treasury system. And rather than Congress then appropriating those funds back to the post office, it said, why don't you just keep a fee, or why don't you just keep a portion of the revenue generated rather than us having to appropriate continued funds. And so in a way that almost seems to have privatized public money that otherwise was destined for the treasury. And so can it really be said that any money destined to have gone into the treasury is included as treasury money to be appropriated? When here, it seems like that was money destined for the treasury, and therefore would have been inclusive, but it was actually privatized instead. So does that mean that all this privatization actually is part of what increases inflation? Because the treasury has to make up for that lost revenue. There's this incentive to market yourself. Okay, I think I'm going to pause it here for That actually is kind of interesting also in the context of the conflict of interest, and how in conflict of interest there is this blurring between acting in one's official capacity and receiving private benefit in that action as in one's official capacity. So that's also quite interesting.
Back at it. Back at it. Where government has actually worked over our entire experience, thus provides another reason to uphold Congress's decision about how to fund the CFPB. But is it working? What happens when there's a shift in how workable something feels? Even if there isn't a cognitive understanding of why something may not feel like it's working anymore, and there's not a cognitive explanation. Regardless, what if it feels like it doesn't work anymore? Then what place does precedent have? What place does our entire experience have? I'm not saying that it becomes irrelevant. I'm not saying that it becomes unimportant, insignificant, meaningless. Perhaps it shifts into a different way of being informative. And perhaps there are different questions that we could be asking. Yeah, see, I think that there's a different question here. I think the court almost became hand-tied? Yeah.
Hold that thought. This case is also kind of interesting because Justice Thomas wrote the opinion, a justice who as far as I can recall, tends to be very conservative in those opinions. And there was a concurrence by Justice Kagan, who if I remember correctly, is quite liberal and progressive. And then you have Justice Alito writing a dissent who tends to be more conservative as far as I remember. So it's kind of interesting to see how the court was sort of diverse in its ideologies coming together. Since the earliest days of our republic, Congress's power over the purse has been its most complete and effectual weapon to ensure that the other branches do not exceed or abuse their authority. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, the Appropriations Clause protects this power by providing that, quote, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law, end quote. Its aim is to ensure that the people's elected representatives monitor and control the expenditure of public funds and the projects they finance, and it imposes on Congress an important duty that it cannot sign away. The federal agency kind of had a carte blanche, blank check. And anytime they wanted to expend funds or expend funds, Congress would sort of have to delineate that appropriation. I'll try and go back and look at that to confirm, but I feel like that was what sort of founded the issue in this case. Yeah, okay. The court upholds, so unfortunately today's decision turns the Appropriations Clause into a minor vestige. The court upholds a novel statutory scheme under which the powerful Consumer Financial Protection Bureau may bankroll its own agenda without any congressional control or oversight.
The court is almost handcuffed here to rule the constitutionality because of such a generalized structure. I'm finding myself questioning whether this has more to do with, has less to do with a generalized structure or the structure at all, and more perhaps to do with the interpretation of that structure. And using this specific case as an example, interpreting a very generalized, simplistic structure, that umbrella phrase within the appropriations clause, interpreting that clause, that structure, very literally and contextually as very segmented. So segmenting a portion of history and utilizing that segment predominantly, prioritizing that segment simultaneously with reading the text very literally, sort of as to paint a picture of how to apply that structure to a specific scenario, a specific context today. However, there's something in claiming this act to be constitutional that leaves an unsatisfied feeling. It feels very unsatisfying. And it's not just about claiming the congressional act as constitutional. There's something else that feels like it's going on here. And there's a bigger question, there's a bigger invitation around how interpretation is conducted, so to speak. Well, it's kind of interesting, actually, because, I mean, according to the way I'm reading this, may or may not be accurate fully, but no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. So this is only referring really to, like, the question around what is an appropriation and what is not an appropriation, and really only comes into question when there is the potential of money being drawn from the Treasury.
Hold that thought. The framers would be shocked, even horrified by the scheme. Beginning with the first Congress, agencies were generally funded by annual appropriations from the Treasury. While there have been departures from this dominant model, nothing like the CFPB's funding scheme has previously been seen. In the decision below, the Fifth Circuit held that the CFPB's unparalleled financial independence violates the Appropriations Clause and the constitutional separation of powers.
Okay, so the CFPB was given an unprecedented way of obtaining funds that was expressly designed to make it totally independent of the congressional appropriations process. Under that scheme, the CFPB is not funded by appropriations enacted by Congress. Instead, each year the CFPB tells the Board of Governors how much money, total operating, the Board of Governors must, okay. These earnings come from the Federal Reserve Banks, which are federally chartered corporations that are not departments of the government. The Federal Reserve Bank's earnings represent interest on and gains derived from the purchase and sale of securities. In addition, the CFPB, unlike most agencies, does not have to return any unspent funds to the Treasury. So the dissent, I mean, according to this, it seems like the dissent is almost saying this isn't even an appropriations question. funding structure is unconstitutional beyond the appropriations clause, I suppose. Like, it's not just about the appropriations clause, it's how the, you know, separate branches are interfering with each other. Yeah, see, I don't know that it, I mean, according to what I just read, I don't know that it necessarily violates the appropriations clause. I mean, it seems like what they're saying is it's not even public money, per se, that it's private. An executive agency predominantly funded by private corporations. I guess my question is, how does the Federal Reserve System relate to the Treasury?
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm just thinking about the timing. Was there something interesting about the timing there? Because it doesn't really seem like there's a tremendous amount coming through about anything other than the timing and questioning how I feel about the timing. I don't know why the general fund is coming through. I don't know what the equivalent to the Treasury would be in the context of the city. And I guess honestly, I'm not even really sure where the court stood prior to this point, prior to this case. I don't really know specifically where the court, where the law was kind of leaning prior to this case. So it could be considered a reining in. But interestingly, yeah, so in the city council, in the Troy city in the context of the planning board, it just feels like the planning board has more broad discretionary authority to expend funds and to finance actions that are perceived as necessary and proper to its functioning. And so there's a broader array of actions that are considered necessary and proper, that are specifically textually enumerated in the statutory language. And I don't know. Just something interesting.